It will always be funny to me that Ben Shapiro is like, mainstream media is too liberal, so we should produce media that impacts popular culture from a conservative perspective. And then he immediately proceeded to exclusively make media that could only possibly appeal to hardcore conservatives. Surely the point was to make it so from the Academy Awards to the box office to independent film festivals, there is content being produced by a conservative media company. Surely the way to achieve that would have been to make content that actually appeals to the average person rather than stuffing every scene full of your conservative grievances.
Teacher led us in a moment of silence for all the workers exploited by the capitalistic system.
Honestly, if I was Mr. Shapiro, moving into producing films and TV shows, I'd make a point of producing a lot of content with no obvious political messaging whatsoever, just to get a foot in the door of the mainstream. You know, make something so good that even progressives are forced to admit it. Then, once you've got them hooked, you can start inserting your politics into everything. Because, is the average mainstream film now even that political? Obviously, Hollywood actors tend to be liberal, but in terms of the films that are being made, superhero films are really big right now, and most of them don't have an overwhelmingly liberal message. Fantasy films like the Fantastic Beasts films that came out recently were pretty politically neutral. Most of the Oscar movies don't feel overtly political. There are obvious standout exceptions. Barbie is the best and most successful example. One scene was so on the nose, I found it a bit cringy. Comment below with some other examples of overly liberal films if you like. The thing is, those movies stand out because they're not the norm. If every single Hollywood movie was as overtly political as Barbie, people would get tired of it and the movies would fail. Most of Ben Shapiro's explicitly conservative movies are more tiresome with their politics than even Barbie was.
Bug-based foods, mRNA vaccines, equitable and inclusive hiking. There it is.
Without any of the redeeming features Barbie had. Now, maybe I'm just ignorant of the brainwashing. Maybe every blockbuster movie is filled with liberal propaganda. But if that's the case, well, I'd rather be brainwashed by subtle political messaging than rolling my eyes at the most overt political messaging ever. Anyway, to simplify things, I'll just focus on 3 different ways that media can be political. The first one that actually does pervade Hollywood is forced diversity. The thing about this complaint is if you take it too far, you become the weirdo arguing it's political for a movie to acknowledge that black people and even women exist.
Black Panther earlier this year, which had a suspicious amount of female characters surrounding the Wakandan king.
But when it comes to historical events and mythologized histories specifically attached to certain cultures, it can be a bit conspicuous and forced to have diversity crowbarred in there. It's obviously more ridiculous with historical events where real people are cast to be the wrong race, but even in the case of fantasy it seems kind of forced. Like, The Lord of the Rings is clearly a fantastical history of Europe, so a lot of the characters will be white. The Daily Wire might actually do a good job countering this, to be fair. Snow White is a Germanic fairy tale, and yet Disney have made the cast much more diverse in their upcoming remake. The Daily Wire are countering that with their own version of the story that puts the white back in Snow White. I mean, the movie would still have to be good, but since Disney's remakes are reliably bad, maybe the Daily Wire could actually get the W over woke Hollywood here. The next way to get politics in media would be covering real events that fit a particular narrative. First example I thought of was Judas and the Black Messiah. It's a movie about a brave black communist with integrity who was murdered by the American government. Now, obviously, this event happened, but the choice to tell this story through media clearly has some political implications that run against conservatism. And there are many other examples of true stories that make conservative ideals look bad.
'Cause what they did was technically high treason.
The obvious counter here would be for the Daily Wire to tell true stories that give a slightly more positive impression of conservative ideals, and they've actually done this. They partnered with a company to produce this movie called Sound of Hope, which I haven't seen, but it's about a Christian community that makes an active effort to adopt loads of kids otherwise in foster care. You know, it's about family and faith and a small group of people coming together to help each other instead of relying on the damn government. That's a good way to take a true story that displays some conservative values. I mean, the executive producer did publicly condemn the Daily Wire's involvement, so that's not exactly a great look, but onwards and upwards. Finally, there's political comedy. You know, like an Adam McKay movie, or Don't Look Up, or the aforementioned Barbie. These movies can potentially do well at the box office, and they can get away with being quite direct about their political messaging if they're mostly comedic. This is also what TV shows like Family Guy and American Dad do with their politics. Oh, and throw Borat in there too. I recently watched the movie Io Capitano, which was not a comedy. It's basically about this illegal immigrant who travels from his home to try to enter Italy illegally. On the way, he faces criminal gangs who torture torture people and sell them as slaves and rob them, but eventually he ends up getting to Italy and the ending is sort of triumphant, and I thought that was kind of weird because isn't the movie tacitly endorsing this series of events? Like, the ending of the movie is very much like, hey, it's a good thing he did this, because in the end he got to Italy, and now he gets to stay there. But he still gave money to human traffickers. Is that really a good thing? This is one of the most expressly progressive movies I've seen recently. It's literally pro-illegal immigration, which is a hot-button political issue in the US, even more than in Europe as far as I can tell. And I was thinking, hey, there could be a conservative satirical comedy about that. Like, a story about an illegal immigrant who travels to the US with the help of human trafficking gangs, and then all the progressives celebrate their story as inspirational and basically end up running promo for human trafficking. Then the story could progress with the revelation that this is leading to these gangs becoming even more popular and shenanigans unfold from there. That message works because while it's clearly conservative, it's making a point that is pretty accessible to the average person. Even people who are generally pro-immigration could probably recognize here that celebrating illegal immigration isn't always a great thing. So maybe they should make a movie like that. But then, they sort of already did that, didn't they? Most people would probably agree that a biological male shouldn't be able to just identify as a woman and start playing in women's leagues. A movie critiquing that wouldn't just be appropriate for hardcore conservatives. But well, they screw that up too, because that's the very film that's famous for being filled with so many peripheral conservative grievances.
70% of all people in prison come from broken families. She's twice as likely to do drugs, twice as likely to drop out of school, 4 times as likely to have trouble fitting in, 3 times as likely to end up in therapy.
That it would become utterly intolerable, probably even to most conservatives, never mind having an impact on the mainstream. So it's with all this in mind that I decided to watch Mr Birchum. How well does it advance Shapiro's goals? Also, I guess I'll briefly touch on the question of whether it's any good. It's not bad, depending on your expectations going into it. The world is full of cheap Family Guy knockoff animated sitcoms, and none of them are good. Most of them are terrible. Also, the Daily Wire's recent efforts at comedy have been very cringy. This is a Family Guy knockoff animated sitcom produced by the Daily Wire. My expectations could not have been lower, so compared to that, I was pleasantly surprised. If you're going into this expecting a genuinely good comedy in its own right, then this is awful. But was anybody going into this expecting that? Since most people expected this show to be terrible, I'll start off with some things I actually like. So let me present my top 10 moments from Mr Birchum. These are moments that actually made me feel like I was watching a comedy. In the number 10 spot, we have this clip where they make Veterans Day sound kinda gay.
This is no time to be gay. Veterans Day is for dressing up in uniforms and marching in parades.
It's not that funny, but it's kind of subversive for a conservative comedy to make this joke, so I liked it in that context. Next, we have the clearest political joke with this one.
Last semester, I got written up for saying this kid threw like a girl. But then, 2 months later, that same kid started identifying as a girl, and nobody apologized to me.
I just like the idea that Mr Birchum preemptively affirmed a student's gender identity and feels annoyed about it. In 8th place,
a few weeks ago, a rapper wanted to shoot there.
A video?
His manager got really ugly.
I like this double entendre. Rappers do be shooting music videos, but they also are associated with gun violence. Coming in 7th is an entire subplot where Mr Birchum's daughter is annoyed at her mum for painting over rustic furniture with white paint.
Mom, there's clear mahogany under here, except some idiot painted over it with this horrible white paint.
This isn't that funny, but it's so refreshing to have a pretty much apolitical gripe expressed in this show. I've seen plenty of people complain about this growing trend of bland, sterile modern interior design, so I assume this episode calling out this trend would have quite wide appeal. Speaking of wide,
we grew up listening to Thin Lizzy. Now we got Fat Lizzo.
Brilliant. And then in 5th place,
grades should reflect every student's individuality by all being the same.
I like the logic of the joke here. Like, yeah, I guess accommodating everyone's unique difficulties would make everyone end up the same in terms of how they're evaluated. Can't argue with that. Just missing out on the podium, there's...
What is he, a cult leader? Scratch that. Cult leaders actually get chicks.
Solid joke. Cult leaders do have all sorts of weird sex things going on. With the bronze medal, we have...
sharing this moment with you makes killing all them guys worth it.
Okay.
In case you haven't noticed yet, I like jokes that take logical premises and arrive at counterintuitive conclusions. In this case, this character is a gang member who's doing work as part of his parole. So when he said this, there's a logic to why he's saying it. If he hadn't killed those guys, he wouldn't have met Mr Birchum, whom he now likes. But obviously at the same time, that's a weird thing to say and puts Mr Birchum in a weird situation, like, I'm glad you killed all those people too, buddy. And the silver medal goes to...
Who shot JR? What was Willis talking about? Everyone was trying to avoid the Noid and AIDS.
A lot of these jokes obviously rely on context that I'm not sure I've been able to fully give, but I want to explain the full context behind my reasoning here. Despite the fact this show is supposed to be triggering and offensive, it's mostly just bland and boring. A lot of the comedy is the most uninspired observational comedy that never excels beyond the mundane, so when he starts listing off things from the 80s, you're mentally prepared for a lame, back in my day things were better rant about how kids can't read books anymore, they just play video games. So within that context, this guy just casually mentioning AIDS is hilarious. Of course, that's with the caveat it only works because the rest of the show is so bland that there's a shock humour element at play. And I'm sure you're wondering, what could possibly beat that killer joke? What gets the gold medal? What is the ultimate winner? Well, I can reveal there isn't one. I could only come up with 9 moments from the show that I liked, but I thought saying it's a top 10 would sound more impressive. Sorry. I'll generally praise that this show clearly has some thought behind the plot progression. It's not intricate or anything, but fans of my Family Guy reviews will remember one of my big gripes was how poorly constructed the plots were for those. This show doesn't have that problem. Also, some of the character dynamics are decent. They actually play around with the idea that maybe Mr. Birchum isn't such a great dad, and all the main family members have their own unique priorities and issues. This is basic stuff, but there are other shows that get it seriously wrong. Unfortunately, that's where my praise quite abruptly stops. There are a few moments where they clearly try to have some sort of emotional resonance and it just falls flat, because like I say, the character writing isn't great. They also miss some great opportunities for more introspective episodes that could give the characters more depth. But if there's one singular issue, it's that this show isn't funny. These episodes are actually about 25 minutes long, so longer than your typical animated sitcom, and I could only come up with 9 jokes I could at all praise from 6 episodes. That's 1.5 good jokes per episode. So imagine what it was like for the rest of the time. Obviously, communicating that a show isn't funny is one of the hardest things about reviewing a comedy. Like, I can show you a given scene and say, look, this isn't funny, but I could also probably find some unfunny moments from even a pretty great comedy, so that doesn't prove much. Instead, I'll just focus on the cold opens. Obviously, cold opens are supposed to set up the show. They're supposed to drive home why you should be excited about the forthcoming episode, and any cold open should especially end on a good joke. This is the type of joke the cold opens here end on.
And we will get our Just Desserts! Literally, one of the stops is a new bakery called Just Desserts.
Or how about this one, the last cold open of the season.
What? I thought you loved hot sauce.
Comedy genius. Somebody doesn't like that hot sauce has been put in their coffee, and then the person who put it in there says, I thought you liked hot sauce. I won't go through all 6, but they had 6 opportunities with these cold opens to start off strong, and I've just shown you the quality on offer from a third of them. Also, this show uses the cutaway format because it's a Family Guy ripoff, and the cutaway jokes are always terrible. Cutaway jokes, again, should be an opportunity to show some pure comedy unconstrained by the context of the narrative. But instead, the cutaways are often, well, the big issue is that they just show you a joke that's already been made. Like, there's one example where Mr. Birchum says, you ever see a vegan wolf? And then the cutaway is a wolf saying, I'm a vegan. Seriously, I'm not kidding.
You ever see a vegan wolf on the Nature Channel?
I'm a vegan.
And then there's...
The blade on my miter saw at school is so dull, it wouldn't cut a balloon.
So literally, Mr. Birchum says the blade wouldn't cut a balloon, and then we see somebody try to cut a balloon with it and fail. This is worse than even the worst episode of Family Guy. This is worse than even the most insulting parodies of Family Guy. A character says a thing, and then we see that thing happen. That's it. By the way, that balloon joke is also part of a cold open, and that hot sauce joke I already mentioned, that was also a cutaway.
Not the worst thing you've put in my coffee.
He says that Mr. Birchum has put bad things in his coffee before, then we see Mr. Birchum put bad things in his coffee. Aside from that, a few more generic negatives. Firstly, especially in the first episode, a lot of the expository dialogue is a bit awkward. Also, I don't know if this was just a tech problem unique to me, but for some reason the frame rate appears to drop massively at some random points. At one point they mistranslate Shakespeare.
Romeo, ¿dónde estáis vos, Romeo?
The context here is that woke lefty man is planning to do a non-binary gay version of Romeo and Romeo, and he blackmails Mr. Birchum into helping him build the set, which I thought was going to be the main focus of the episode, but it ends up just being about him looking for tools. Anyway, for the record, wherefore means why, not where, whereas this kid clearly says donde está, which means where. I thought conservatives were all about teaching the classics. Shouldn't they have a bit more Shakespeare literacy? Also, my final negative is that while I was in the middle of my Mr. Birchum marathon, I went to make myself lunch and I cut my finger open. 2 out of 10. So the show isn't great, unfortunately, but the real question is, how good of a job did it do at pushing Mr. Shapiro's conservative agenda in a way that isn't cringy? As an accurate representation of the median voter, I feel I'm in a good position to make that assessment. I will start off saying the politics in this show isn't that cringy for one simple reason. For the most part, it's limited to 2 main characters. See, what was cringy about Lady Ballers is that every single line of dialogue sounded like a rant straight from the mouth of Ben Shapiro, or a straw man straight from his brain. In this show, there's really only one character who says very much conservative, and that's Mr. Birchum. With just one really conservative character, you could liken this to Ron Swanson in Parks and Rec, a character with strong political opinions that doesn't necessarily speak to the overall show being obnoxiously political. And honestly, Mr. Birchum isn't that political. He's not constantly complaining about abortion or immigration or things like that. He complains about gender stuff, but mostly seemingly just annoyed by it. The show is surprisingly apolitical. Like, one time they call out Mr. Birchum for showing kids inappropriate content, but it's just a really graphic safety video for his woodwork class, not like a Donald Trump speech. Also, Mr. Birchum does have some flaws. It's implied his toxic masculinity has negatively impacted his relationship with his son. Probably the biggest time the show dunks on his view is when he expresses anti-union sentiment in one episode, but then by the end of the episode he ends up having his rights protected by the union.
So you only got 3 days of unpaid suspension.
Yeah, thank God for the union.
Actually, on second watch, maybe he was being sarcastic, in which case, praise revoked. Also, his wife is an Obama supporter, and while she definitely doesn't have any major wins, she also doesn't take any major L's either. So again, that's less obnoxiously political than I'd expect. He also has a son who's a gaming streamer, and they make fun of that, but what's interesting is that it's eventually revealed he's making more money than his dad and is also quite successful with the ladies, so Birchum is forced to confront his negative prejudices about his son's non-traditional profession. At the same time though, Ben Shapiro is basically a streamer himself who makes loads of money sitting around doing nothing, and then makes stupid statements like this.
No one in the United States should be retiring at 65 years old. Frankly, I think retirement itself is a stupid idea unless you have some sort of health problem.
So maybe he wanted to include a character to validate that doing nothing on YouTube for a living is actually super valid. Almost all the hardcore political complaining is centered around this one character called Vorsh. Basically, he's a super stereotypical woke lefty who's always talking about how many genders there are and how you shouldn't assume them and...
No, intersectionality has nothing to do with traffic. No, you don't have to be pregnant to be a birthing person. No, BIPOC is not a dead rapper.
It's still mostly limited to one character, but this character is very prominent and always talking about this stuff. So overall, don't get it twisted. This show is still obnoxiously political, but it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be going into it. I said the best strategy for the Daily Wire would be to make media not bogged down too much by politics and instead focus on just making good content. I wouldn't say this show is bogged down by its conservative politics, but it's still not good, and that was quite an important part of the brilliant strategy I laid out. So since the show isn't good, probably don't watch it.
This is must-see TV.
But if you'd like to watch more of my content, make sure to subscribe and do all the algorithm things, and YouTube thinks you'd like to watch this video next. Bye.